Good morning. Today we're going to be reading chapter 6 and 7. Chapter 6 begins on page 46, and that's where I'm going to begin. It's called Colonel Russell's Company. That afternoon, we came up with Colonel Russell's company. Patty and I, sitting on the box with Milt, saw the white topped wagons in the distance, part of them with California painted on their canvas, the rest with Oregon. As we rode closer, we could see the women washing in the creek and hanging clothes on the bushes to dry in the bright sunshine. Some of the men were fishing, while others were working on their wagons. The children, as Milt said, were busy as bird dogs doing nothing. Patty's father, arriving ahead of us, had dismounted from his gray mare and was talking to a portly gentleman with a heavy gold watch chain across his broad chest and a pleasant smile on his face. As Milt brought the oxen to a halt and lifted us down to the ground, Mr. Reed said, "Colonel Russell, this is Mr. Elliot from Springfield, and this is my little daughter, Patty." Colonel Russell shook hands with Milt and Patty, and said to them both in a stately way, "I am exceedingly delighted to have the privilege of meeting you." Then Mr. Reed took him to the door of the palace car to meet the other members of the family. We heard the genial Colonel tell Mrs. Reed and Grandma that he and his party would be happy to have such solid citizens as the Donner and Reed families travel in their company. Patty and I skipped off to see what Leanna and Frances were up to, and to make note of any other little girls who might be Patty's age. That night we had a roaring bonfire, and around it everyone got acquainted. There was a large, jolly family named Breen, all boys to Patty's disappointment, except for baby Isabella. But Mrs. Breen was a hearty, happy soul who took a shine to Patty and Puss. When she found out that Mr. Reed's folks had come from Ireland, she said to Puss, "I was thinking I saw a bit of Irish sparkle in those dancing eyes. It's good to be seeing a pretty colleen like the likes of you about, and me and old Pat with none but boys, excepting the wee one there." Old Pat was her husband, and it wasn't before long that he'd won our hearts too, with his fiddle music. For his wife he played "When I First Saw Sweet Peggy," and a gay young man who was traveling with them named Pat Dolan sang the words, while a good many others joined in. After that there was more singing. Yankee Doodle, Annie Laurie, The Girl I Left Behind Me. Someone suggested "Home Sweet Home," but the rest shouted, "Oh no, not that! We mustn't get homesick yet." Mr. Breen's fiddle broke into strains of Old Dan Tucker, and the boys jumped up, grabbing the girls by the hand, and started to dance on the green prairie. Then there was "Skip to Maloo" and "Hey, Betty Martin." And finally Pat Dolan danced an Irish jig on the tailboard of a wagon while the rest all clapped, and the lively music made my tiny blue slippers feel like jigging too. The girls told Grandma all about it as they crawled into bed, tired but happy. And Puss said of Patrick Dolan, "He could charm the birds right out of the trees." Next day we traveled for several miles over a wet, boggy plain between the Kansas River and Soldier's Creek. By 3 o'clock, the rain was pouring down, and the men decided it would be best to halt on a high ridge of ground and make camp. There was no bonfire that night, and supper was cooked on the small stove inside the palace car. Patty's father came to sit with us till bedtime and talk about our plans. "Some of the folks think we are traveling too slowly," he said. "A party of wagons bound for Oregon is going to leave Colonel Russell's company and move ahead faster." And he added thoughtfully, "Perhaps we'd be wise to join them." "We have plenty of supplies, James, and it's better not to tire out the oxen at the beginning of the journey, isn't it?" Patty's mother said. "It isn't that that's worrying me. This is the easy part of the trip, but we must be sure to get past the mountains before there is danger of snowstorms." "Yes," said Grandma, "I've heard tell of parties who tried to cross the Cumberland Mountains too late in the season and got snowed in for the winter and like to have starved to death. When they wandered down into the settlements in the spring, they were perfect scarecrows of folks." Patty and I, listening to the conversation, shuddered at this horrid thought. "The Donners and I thought we'd discuss it with Colonel Russell tomorrow. We should be making at least 10 miles a day." The prairies were sweet smelling after the rain, and the meadow larks were singing in the morning sunshine as the wagons lurched and swayed over the wet roads next day. Puss came back to tell us we'd be crossing a creek with steep banks before long. Father and the other men are exploring the slopes to see if there's any break in them where the wagons can roll down easily. If they can't find a place, they'll have to lower the wagons with ropes. Tommy and Jimmy were excited at the prospect of another ride through the air, but Grandma told them, "I reckon the men who do the back work don't admire this sort of crossing as much as you young ones do." With ropes and hooks and various lines, they got the wagons down, and after crossing the creek, the oxen teams were doubled up to haul us up the opposite bank. It took from noon to 4 o'clock to complete the job, and by the time our wagon got to the other side, the ones ahead had already made camp on high, dry ground about a mile away. "Oh, goody, a picnic!" exclaimed Jimmy as our wagon came to a halt and he saw white tablecloths spread on the grass. The little Donner boys came whooping out ahead, and before their mothers could think to warn them to keep clean for supper, they had found a mud hole of just the right softness for mud pies. After dinner, the men amused themselves with target practice until dark, while the children played hide and seek among the wagons. There was a blazing campfire that night, and while the older folks sat around it visiting, the young ones coaxed Uncle Patrick, as they all called Mr. Breen, to get out his fizzle and rosin up the bow for some music and dancing. When Mr. Reed looked in at bedtime, he told Grandma that we had only come 6 miles that day. At breakfast next morning, we had a visitor. No less a personage than an Indian chief came and sat down with us uninvited. Mr. Reed said, "How do you do?" to him, and he answered, "How?" and helped himself to Eliza's cornbread and bacon. The children could not help staring round at our strange guest with his ears and neck hung with trinkets and buttons of bone and tin that jangled each time he moved. He must have noticed that we were staring at him, for he leaned over to point out, especially, a medal hanging around the other bangles on his necklace. On one side was a picture of John Tyler, President of the United States. On the other side was a pipe and a tomahawk, and the words, "Peace and Friendship." Mr. Reed read them to us, and the children and their mothers smiled politely to let the Indian know they admired it. After breakfast, Mr. Reed offered him some tobacco, which he accepted without saying thank you, and got up and left. Eliza said, "Well, I swan," and she scrubbed the dishes extra hard. We saw many of these tribesmen that day, for we found that we had camped only 2 miles away from their very large Indian village. Kaws, they called themselves, and not all of them were as polite as our breakfast guest. They swarmed around the wagons, begging for food and buttons and clothes. In fact, for anything they took a fancy to. Most of them were wrapped in dirty blankets and leggings, and all had ornaments of bone and tin and brass on their ears and necks, and even in their nose. Some of them had red paint on their faces, and their hair was tangled and matted. "Are they like the Kentucky Indians?" Patty asked Grandma. "Land, child, I never was that close to so many of 'em afore, but I reckon Indians are Indians wherever you find 'em, and I hope the men will think to double the guard on the camp tonight." For several days the caught Indians followed us, and we began to feel sorry for them. They seemed so hungry and eager to accept anything that was offered them. "Why don't they hunt and get food that way?" Patty asked her father. "They do, Patty," he told her, "but the game is being driven farther and farther west by emigrants and trappers, and before long they will have nothing but roots and berries to eat." That day we passed a party of trappers returning to the settlements. They were packing several large sacks of furs. Suspended from their swaddles were wild turkeys, raccoons, and squirrels.